Few figures in human history have sparked more debate, more devotion, and more division than Jesus of Nazareth. He lived roughly 2,000 years ago in a small corner of the ancient world, yet his name continues to shape civilizations, inspire billions, and divide scholars to this very day. What makes his story so remarkable is that two of the world's great religions, Judaism and Christianity, both acknowledge him, yet understand him in ways that could not be more different. One sees him as a teacher, the other sees him as God in human form. And that difference is not a minor theological footnote. It is the very heart of one of history's greatest religious divides. So who exactly was Jesus of Nazareth, and why does it matter so deeply how we understand him? That is exactly what we are going to explore today. To understand why Judaism and Christianity see Jesus so differently, we first need to understand where both faiths come from. Christianity did not appear out of nowhere. It emerged directly from within Judaism during the first century of the Common Era. Jesus himself was a Jewish man, born into a Jewish family, raised according to Jewish law, and deeply immersed in the traditions, scriptures, and culture of his people. He worshipped in synagogues, observed Jewish customs, and spoke to Jewish audiences about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. His earliest followers were also Jewish. So at its very beginning, what we now call Christianity was essentially a movement within Judaism. Understanding this shared origin is absolutely essential, because it helps explain why the eventual separation between these two faiths was so profound, so personal, and so theologically significant. The disagreement was not between strangers, but between people who shared the same sacred texts and the same ancient promises. So where does Judaism stand on Jesus? In Jewish tradition, Jesus is generally viewed as a Jewish teacher or rabbi who lived in first-century Judea. He walked among the Jewish people, taught in their synagogues, and engaged with the Torah. However, Judaism does not consider him divine. He is not regarded as the Messiah, and he is certainly not seen as a savior of humanity. Many Jewish scholars do acknowledge Jesus as a real historical figure. They accept that he existed, that he gathered followers, and that he was crucified by the Romans. But when it comes to the supernatural claims surrounding him, such as his divine nature, his virgin birth, or his resurrection, Jewish tradition firmly rejects these. For Judaism, accepting such claims would contradict the very foundation of Jewish theology, particularly the absolute oneness and incomparable nature of God. So why exactly does Judaism reject Jesus as the Messiah? The answer lies in what the Hebrew scriptures actually promised. According to Jewish tradition, the Messiah was never expected to be divine. He would be a human king, a descendant of David, who would accomplish very specific and visible tasks. He would rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, gather all Jewish people back to the land of Israel, bring lasting peace to the entire world, and usher in a universal knowledge of God among all nations. These were concrete, physical, and historical expectations. When Jesus was crucified without fulfilling any of these prophecies, Jewish leadership concluded he simply could not be the promised Messiah. From the Jewish perspective, this was not a rejection born out of stubbornness. It was a straightforward application of their own scriptures. The Messiah had a checklist, and Jesus did not complete it. Now, stepping into the Christian perspective, the view shifts dramatically. Christianity does not see Jesus as merely a wise teacher or a failed messianic claimant. Christians believe Jesus is the Son of God, the second person of the Holy Trinity, fully divine and fully human at the same time. According to Christian theology, God himself entered human history in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, not to establish a political kingdom, but to rescue humanity from the deeper problem of sin and spiritual separation from God. Christians believe Jesus did fulfill messianic prophecy, but in a profoundly spiritual sense that went beyond what many expected. And at the very center of the Christian faith stands one extraordinary claim, that after being crucified and buried, Jesus physically rose from the dead. And that resurrection, Christians argue, is the ultimate proof of his divine identity. So how do Christians respond to the Jewish objection that Jesus left so many prophecies unfulfilled? This is where the Christian theological concept of the two comings of Christ becomes essential to understand. Christians argue that messianic prophecy was never meant to be fulfilled all at once. During his first coming, Jesus fulfilled the spiritual dimensions of those prophecies. He became a light to the nations, as foretold in Isaiah. He bore the sins of humanity through his death on the cross. He established a new covenant between God and people of every nation. The remaining prophecies, those concerning world peace, the physical restoration of Israel, and universal knowledge of God, Christians believe will be fulfilled when Jesus returns in his second coming. So from the Christian perspective, the objection is not a contradiction, but simply a misunderstanding of the timeline God always intended. Now let us examine some of the most compelling messianic prophecies from the Hebrew Scriptures that Christians believe point directly to Jesus. One of the most striking is Isaiah 53, written centuries before Jesus was born. It describes a suffering servant who is pierced for the transgressions of others, crushed for iniquities, and who bears the sins of many. Christians see this as an unmistakable portrait of Jesus on the cross. Then there is Psalm 22, where the writer cries out about hands and feet being pierced, garments being divided by casting lots, and being mocked by onlookers, details that align remarkably with crucifixion. Finally, Micah chapter 5 verse 2 specifically predicts that the ruler of Israel would come from Bethlehem, the very town where Jesus was born. Christians interpret these passages not as coincidence, but as deliberate divine foreshadowing of the coming Messiah. Now, it is only fair to present the Jewish response to these prophetic interpretations, because Jewish scholars have thoughtful and well-developed counter-readings of these same texts. Regarding Isaiah 53, Jewish tradition does not interpret the suffering servant as an individual Messiah at all. Instead, Jewish scholars understand this passage as referring collectively to the nation of Israel itself, a people who have historically suffered among the nations, bearing persecution and misunderstanding throughout centuries of exile. In this reading, Israel is the servant, not a future individual redeemer. Similarly, Jewish interpreters read Psalm 22 and other cited passages within their original literary and historical contexts, rather than as predictive prophecies pointing to Jesus. This interpretive disagreement is not trivial. It represents one of the most enduring and serious theological debates between Judaism and Christianity, a conversation that has continued for nearly 2,000 years without simple resolution. Now let us shift to what Christians consider the most powerful evidence of all, the resurrection of Jesus. This is not merely a theological belief held by faith alone. It is a historical claim that can be examined using the same tools historians apply to any ancient event. And here is what is remarkable. Even secular historians and scholars who are not Christians generally acknowledge a core set of facts surrounding this event. First, Jesus died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. This is confirmed by Roman historian Tacitus and Jewish historian Josephus. Second, his tomb was found empty just 3 days later. Third, his disciples sincerely claimed to have encountered him alive after his death. These are not disputed fringe claims. They are widely accepted starting points in historical scholarship. The real question is not whether these facts occurred, but what best explains them. This is where the historical case for Christianity becomes remarkably compelling. Scholars across the theological spectrum, including skeptics, generally accept a core set of minimal facts about the resurrection. First, the disciples genuinely believed they saw the risen Jesus. This was not a legend that developed centuries later. Second, they were willing to suffer and die for this belief. People do not willingly die for something they know is a lie. Third, Paul, a fierce persecutor of Christians, and James, the brother of Jesus, who was a skeptic during Jesus' ministry, both experienced dramatic conversions after claiming to see the risen Christ. Fourth, the tomb was found empty. Even the opponents of early Christianity never produced a body to disprove the resurrection. When you consider all four of these facts together, the resurrection stands as the most historically reasonable explanation available. No alternative theory adequately accounts for all of them simultaneously. Now, skeptics and some within Jewish tradition have proposed alternative explanations for the empty tomb and resurrection appearances. The stolen body theory suggests the disciples secretly took Jesus' body. But this fails to explain why those same disciples would willingly suffer and die for something they knew was a lie. The hallucination theory proposes the disciples experienced grief-induced visions. However, hallucinations are private experiences, and over 500 people reportedly saw the risen Jesus simultaneously, which makes a mass hallucination psychologically implausible. The swoon theory suggests Jesus never actually died, but merely fainted and later revived. Roman executioners were professionals at crucifixion, and medical experts consistently reject this possibility. Historians, including many non-Christian scholars, find these alternative theories far less convincing than the resurrection itself. When all the historical data is examined together, the bodily resurrection of Jesus remains the most coherent and compelling explanation available. So here is where everything converges. If Jesus genuinely rose from the dead, that single event changes everything. It is not simply one miracle among many. It is God's own confirmation that Jesus was exactly who he claimed to be. Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. He claimed to be the only way to salvation. He claimed to be the fulfillment of the entire Jewish scriptural tradition. These are extraordinary claims that any reasonable person should scrutinize carefully. But the resurrection serves as the divine stamp of approval on every single one of those claims. The Apostle Paul understood this clearly when he wrote that if Christ has not been raised, our faith is completely empty and worthless. The resurrection does not stand alone. It validates the teachings, the identity, and the saving mission of Jesus in one decisive, history-altering moment that no alternative theory has adequately explained. Before we go further, it is important to pause and acknowledge something deeply significant. This conversation is not rooted in hostility toward Judaism. Christianity holds profound respect for the Jewish people and their sacred heritage. Christians believe that Jesus came first to the Jewish people, not as a rejection of Judaism, but as its fulfillment. The entire foundation of the Christian faith rests upon the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Without Judaism, there is no Christianity, and it is worth remembering that the very first followers of Jesus were Jewish men and women. The apostles, Peter, James, John, and Paul himself, were all Jewish. They encountered the evidence, examined the scriptures, witnessed the resurrection, and came to believe. Their journey was not a betrayal of their heritage, but a profound expression of it. So let us bring these two perspectives together clearly. Judaism and Christianity do not simply disagree on minor theological details. They hold fundamentally different understandings of who Jesus was and what God's plan for humanity looks like. Judaism, at best, sees Jesus as a moral teacher, and at most, a failed messianic claimant who did not accomplish what the Messiah was expected to accomplish. Christianity, on the other hand, sees Jesus as the divine Son of God, the second person of the Holy Trinity, who entered human history, fulfilled messianic prophecy on a deeper spiritual level, died as an atoning sacrifice for the sins of all humanity, and rose bodily from the dead. These are not small disagreements. They represent two completely different answers to the most important question a person can ask. What is God doing in human history, and how does humanity find its way back to Him? We've covered a lot of ground today, from ancient prophecy to historical evidence, from Jewish expectations to Christian conviction. These are not simple questions, and they deserve serious, honest engagement. So here is my encouragement to you. Do not simply take anyone's word for it, including mine. Read the Hebrew Scriptures for yourself. Study Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, and Micah chapter 5. Examine the historical arguments surrounding the resurrection. Wrestle with the evidence and come to your own informed conclusion. From a Christian perspective, Jesus is not just a figure of debate. He is the fulfillment of the deepest hopes woven throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, the suffering servant, the promised king, the light to every nation. His story is not exclusive. It is an open invitation to every single person, regardless of background, culture, or history. The question he still asks today remains the same. Who do you say that I am?